Today, I want to tell you a story. A story of professional jealousy, pettiness, and passive aggression. Of bullying, racism, and infighting. A story of plagiarism, cease and desists, and federal lawsuits. In 2021, the New York Times titled their article on the story, "Who's the Bad Art Friend?" To the federal government, it's referred to as Larson v. Perry. Most of the rest of the internet knows it as the kidney story. I've been fascinated with this case ever since I read the original article, and given that it has all the hallmarks of a typical internet drama plus the insane hook of all this drama is about a kidney donation, I was sure that someone on YouTube must have made a viral deep dive on this story before. But surprisingly, I only found a couple videos on the topic, and they seem pretty confined to the writing community, which in a way makes sense. The story on its surface sounds esoteric, like it would be difficult to understand and even harder to relate to unless you had intimate knowledge of the writing and publishing industry, and how copyright lawsuits work. The thing is, the more I revisit the story, the more I relate to it, and the more I feel the need to share my thoughts. I'm not just gonna read the New York Times article to you, I promise, although you should go read it because it's great. I want to talk about what writers owe the real-life people that inspired them, the distinction between what is ethical and what is right, and above all, what it means to present yourself as a completely different person than who you are in private or even within your own head. This is the story of an aspiring writer who committed a selfless act for possibly less than selfless reasons, and one acquaintance who took inspiration from the situation to write what would become an award-winning short story, and a controversy that would land them both in court. Without further ado, this is the story of Dawn Dorland and Sonia Larson. Let's introduce our main characters. Firstly, we have Dawn Dorland, an essayist, writing teacher, and aspiring author originally from a poorer white family in rural Iowa. Dawn is also, seemingly, an incredibly compassionate person. There is a sunny earnestness to Dawn Dorland, an unself-conscious openness that endears her to some people and that others have found to be a little extra. She seems very people-focused, very touchy-feely. I get the impression that she wants to bare her heart and soul to everyone she meets and expects them to do the same in response. I can absolutely understand how this type of personality would be divisive. It might be emotionally draining to interact with someone who always expects and puts forth complete authenticity, but I could also see how the very same thing could be refreshing. A word Dawn would later use to describe herself is service-oriented. She volunteers, of course, and in 2015, she decided to partake in a non-directed organ donation, donating one of her kidneys to a stranger in need. This is the first event that we can add to our timeline. Around the same time that Dawn underwent her surgery, she also made a Facebook group to document and share her organ donation journey and invited some family, friends, and peers to the group. I don't know enough about Facebook etiquette to know how normal this idea was, but the important point is that one of these people was our second character, Sonia Larson. Sonia Larson was born in middle-class Minnesota to a mixed family, her mom being Chinese and her dad being white. She had planned to become a writer since undergrad, and soon after graduating, moved to Boston where she found work at a local writing center called Grub Street. She had found some success with short stories published in literary magazines, and quickly became something of a leader at the organization and within the local community. One of the people that knew Sonia was Dawn. Upon first meeting, they would have been around the same age, and both aspiring authors who had not been published at that point. According to Dawn, the two were pretty close, with Sonia confiding in her about her personal life and professional endeavors, and encouraging Dawn to apply to work at Grub Street. She did, but she was not hired. Sonia, though, would later say that she and Dawn were no more than acquaintances. Dawn donated her kidney 8 years after meeting Sonia. By that time, she was living in California while Sonia was still in Boston. But as mentioned before, Dawn had added Sonia, along with several other people from her old Grub Street days, to the Facebook group dedicated to her organ donation. However, Sonia didn't respond to her posts the way that Dawn anticipated. Specifically, she didn't respond at all. Sonia didn't like or react or comment to a single post Dawn made referencing her kidney donation or living organ donation advocacy. Dawn thought that this was strange, so she sent a message to catch up. When Sonia responded, asking how she'd been, Dawn replied with a longer message that included,
"I think you're aware that I donated my kidney this summer, right?"
Yes, I did see on Facebook that you donated your kidney. What a tremendous thing.
Afterward, Dorland would wonder, if she really thought it was that great, why did she need reminding that it happened? The two women would see each other at a few writing events over the next year where the topic would stay unmentioned, not just by Sonia, but by the other Grub Street members as well.
It was a little bit like if you've been at a funeral and nobody wanted to talk about it. It was just strange to me. I left that conference with this question: do writers not care about my kidney donation? which kind of confused me because I thought I was in a community of service-oriented people.
Okay, so I have to break my faux objective New York Times style retelling of events to weigh in here. Like, at this point in the story, this is where I started to find Dawn's behavior a little odd. Like, what do you mean you think it's strange that nobody mentioned your surgery? These are your former friends slash acquaintances you've barely seen in person in years, and we're talking about an elective surgery you underwent nearly a year ago at this point. Wouldn't they want to discuss work and pieces and stuff? Not something so one-sided and personal? Plus, if I were Dawn, I'd have assumed that they just forgot. This is something that is really only important to two people, the person who donated the kidney and the person who received the kidney. But she talks about it like it's a given that it's at the forefront of everyone's minds, and they're just choosing to ignore it, when in reality, maybe it's only at the forefront of Dawn's mind. And then we have to talk about this crazy quote.
I left that conference with this question: do writers not care about my kidney donation? Which kind of confused me because I thought I was in a community of service-oriented people.
First of all, do writers not care about my kidney donation is an insane line, and I straightforwardly love it. Secondly, where did this self-righteousness come from? Why do you assume that these people aren't service-oriented, however you define that, based on their reaction to your actions? Would praising and commending you make them more virtuous? It just seems like you're centering yourself in a story about doing something seemingly selfless for another person, and then calling other people selfish for not playing along. The quote, which is a direct quote straight from her brain, not editorializing from the New York Times, seems to be blatantly saying, if I do a good deed, I expect credit and attention for it. And sure, being egotistical about your actions does not undercut the goodness about what you do. I'm sure the patient who received her kidney does not mind if you're egotistical as well as compassionate. But if your actions are entirely motivated by the desire for positive feedback, and I'm not saying that that's definitely the case here, then you aren't compassionate in the first place. Another line in the article is reminiscent of the same high and mighty sentiment. Dorland is not shy about explaining how her past has afforded her a degree of moral clarity that others might not come by so easily. This is also a somewhat pompous strain of thought to me. Now, surely moral clarity wasn't her exact phrase, but I assume she conveyed something along the lines of a good set of morals combined with a unique ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Isn't this a strange thing to say about yourself? Like, yeah, everyone thinks that they have a good set of morals, or else they wouldn't hold them. Plus, I'm really thinking about the implications of her apparently saying this regularly and readily enough that the New York Times described it as her not being shy about explaining. For another thing about Dawn that I flagged as being a little weird, take this quote.
I'm compelled at funerals to shake hands with the dusty men who dig our graves.
It's hard to judge this one without its full context, but I think Dawn wants to reach out and build connections with people she would otherwise not interact with, and thereby sympathize with. The problem, of course, lies in how you go about it. How does meeting Dawn enhance the lives of these random workers who are trying to do a job? And from Dawn's perspective, how much can she really learn about their experiences while briefly meeting them at a literal funeral? And I even read her subtly patronizing and denigrating them in this quote, the dusty men who dig our graves. Emphasizing the importance of reaching out to those who have been othered from you can accidentally expose the fact that you yourself also view them as an other, as someone lesser who requires special consideration from an especially kind-hearted soul like you. Wow, you interacted with someone performing manual labor, and you even touched them. How unthinkable. By drawing attention to the exceptional nature of your own actions, you are implying that it is a little odd to be nice to these people. You couldn't possibly do so nonchalantly, just like they're anyone else. So yeah, I kind of buried the lead here. When I spoke before about how Dawn presents herself and how that personality might be grating to some people while endearing to others, I took for granted that it was authentic. We don't know that anyone's public persona is a true reflection of their own personal morals as opposed to a calculated decision for the sake of creating an advantageous public image. I mean, is it not widely accepted at this point that anyone who uses kindness, compassion, and positivity as their personal brand is secretly a psychopath? In seriousness, I think finding the true nature of a person's soul is a fruitless endeavor, let alone when you don't even know the person in real life. But what we can do is judge their actions and their words, because you don't need to know someone's intentions to judge those. And having said all that, Dawn is, in my opinion, weird for expecting people to commend her for her kidney donation and wrong to hold it against them if they don't, as if that makes them worse people. But y'all, this is all still setup. I haven't even gotten into the story of this story. So during the year-long period that Sonia seemed distant to Dawn and reticent on the kidney topic, she was actually following the situation very closely. She was part of a group with other Grub Street writers titled the Chunky Monkeys when one writer texted,
I'm now following Dawn Dorland's kidney post with creepy fascination.
Oh my god, right? The whole thing, though I try to ignore it, persists in making me feel uncomfortable. I just can't help but think that she is feeding off the whole thing. Of course, I feel evil saying this and can't really talk with anyone about it.
It seems like she and the others had a lot of the same thoughts that I just expressed. But these did not remain just musings in their heads or private messages in group chats or email threads. The whole situation inspired Sonia to do something more with it. Write. And in the next year, Sonia would send several drafts of a short story entitled The Kindest to the Chunky Monkeys. She would go on to submit The Kindest to a print magazine and a writing festival. And nobody in the know had any misgivings on who inspired the story. The story is about a Chinese-American woman named Shun Tao who is injured while driving drunk and requires a kidney transplant in order to survive. She receives a kidney from an anonymous, otherwise healthy living donor named Rose, although in early versions of the story, the character's name was literally Dawn. Rose would later send Shun Tao a letter expressing her wish to meet her in person. When Rose arrives, her presence makes Shun Tao and her husband uncomfortable. While her husband feels anxious over the need to express their gratitude, Shun Tao is vaguely offended by Rose's behavior, which at times reads as presumptuous, ignorant, and self-centered. But the connections between Sonia's short story and real life go far beyond the character of Rose/Dawn. Not only does Rose reach out after the surgery to meet Shun Tao in person, just like the real-life Dawn reached out to the man who received her kidney, but she does so with a letter. A letter that Dawn posted onto the previously mentioned Facebook group for others to read. A letter that Sonia would take sections from and put verbatim into her short story. Yeah. So now we're in a new category here. Basing a character off of a real-life person is one thing. Even writing an entire story pretty transparently inspired by their life probably happens more often than we think. But actual words, written by another person, are protected by copyright. We're no longer just in the territory of writing ethics, but legality. Courts have already declared personal letters protected by copyright law and thus protected from being published against the wishes of the letter's author. And this applies regardless of whether the letters were published by the author elsewhere. It's their letter. They can post it if they want to, and it doesn't make it free game to copy it and publish it wherever and whenever you want to. But of course, there are many factors that courts weigh in order to determine if use of a copyrighted work counts as unlawfully infringing or if it is simply fair use, and oftentimes individual cases can only be settled in a court of law. You're probably wondering how literal I'm being when I say that the letter was copied verbatim. Well, as with almost all texts, The Kindest would go through multiple drafts, and we can and probably should assume that the earliest drafts of the story were never meant to be published as they were. So although the earliest versions call the donor character Dawn, what really matters is the version that ended up published. The thing is, multiple versions of The Kindest would go on to be published in different places. Let's go chronologically. The first version of the letter that would end up released publicly in any capacity was recorded as an audiobook and posted for sale on Audible in 2016. On the left are the pertinent passages of Dawn's letter. On the right is how they appeared in Sonia's story.
Personally, my childhood was marked by trauma and abuse. I didn't have the opportunity to form secure attachments with my family of origin. A positive outcome of my early life is empathy, that it opened a well of possibility between me and strangers. While perhaps many more people would be motivated to donate an organ to a friend or family member in need, to me, the suffering of strangers is just as real.
My own childhood was marked by trauma and abuse. While others might desire to give to a family member or friend, to me, the suffering of strangers is just as real. The next version of the story appeared in August of 2017, published by the magazine American Short Fiction.
Throughout my preparation for becoming a donor, I focused a majority of my mental energy on imagining and celebrating you.
As I prepared to make this donation, I drew strength from knowing that my recipient would get a second chance at life. I withstood the pain by imagining and rejoicing in you. Finally, the story would be edited in June of 2018 for the Boston Book Festival. Now the letter is basically unrecognizable as Dawn's. You would only think of Dawn's letter if you knew the character was based on her to begin with. Although, notably, the sign-off at the end of the letter would change from warmly to kindly. Why is this relevant? Because that is how Dawn Dorland has signed off every single one of her correspondences for years and years. So maybe you don't think that any version of this letter is necessarily illegal, but I think we can agree that a recognizable version was at one point released to the public. In January of 2016, Sonia would even message friends.
I think I'm done with the kidney story, but I feel nervous about sending it out because it literally has sentences that I verbatim grabbed from Dawn's letter on Facebook. I've tried to change it, but I can't seem to. That letter was just too damn good. I'm not sure what to do, feeling morally compromised, like a good artist but a shitty person.
The message is both pretty damning and also kind of dumb. Like, when I first read this part of the article, I thought, no, Sonia, you should not feel like a good artist. Using another person's words in your text is the exact kind of thing a good artist would not do. Clearly, over the course of working on the story, something encouraged Sonia to edit the letter to have less and less in common with Dawn's original. This would suggest that she learned over time that keeping the letter in the story was a bad idea. Maybe she came to her senses on her own, maybe she even felt bad about the earlier versions of the story. But you know what would be even more damning, though? If something had tipped her off. If she knew the original inspiration for the story was about to be revealed, and she was trying to cover her tracks. Let's return to Dawn and see what she's up to. In June of 2016, Dawn hears from a mutual friend on Facebook that Sonia is working on a story about a kidney donation. This is after Dawn had her whole email correspondence with Sonia about how she didn't interact with the Facebook posts referencing her kidney. And if we remember how those emails went, Sonia said,
Yes, I did see on Facebook that you donated your kidney. What a tremendous thing.
but we now know that during this whole exchange, Sonia was working on a short story inspired by the event. If you think this seems like Sonia was feigning ignorance to Dawn to distract from this fact, Dawn would agree with you. Dawn messaged Sonia again after hearing about the story with a simple,
Hey, I heard you wrote a kidney donation story. Cool. Can I read it?
Sonia responded by immediately trying to downplay the relationship between the story and real life. She calls the story
Partially inspired by how my imagination took off after learning of your own tremendous donation. I want to emphasize that my story is not about you or your particular gift, but about narrative possibilities I began thinking about in the context of kidney donation. It is a work of fiction formed wholly by my own imagination.
Dawn then points out how Sonia first acted like she had nearly forgotten about her organ donation, which now seemed like a front.
It's the interpersonal layer that feels off to me, Sonia. You seemed not to be aware of my donation until I pointed it out. But if you had already kicked off your fictional project at this time, well, I think your behavior is a little deceptive. At least weird.
At this point, I think Sonia was annoyed that she even had to have this conversation. When she replied back, she brought up behavior that she found weird, the issue of Dawn seeking validation for her organ donation.
For this email exchange, I hadn't considered that my individual vocal support, or absence of it, was of much significance.
This email exchange would continue over the summer, and by the end, they would have formed a fragile truce, in the words of the New York Times article. But this whole time, Dawn had never read the story and had no idea about the letter being used. And behind the scenes, Sonia was getting to work. She received the first email from Dawn asking to read the story on June 30th. Sometime between July 1st and July 15th, depending on the source, Sonia edits the story and sends a message to her publisher asking to take down the previous versions. Dawn would not read The Kindest until June of 2018, a full 2 years later, when American Short Fiction would drop the paywall for the story. The entire time, she had no idea about the actual content. And when she did, boy would it set her off. As I prepared to make this donation, I drew strength from knowing that my recipient would get a second chance at life. I withstood the pain by imagining and rejoicing in you. Upon realizing that parts of her letter were used in the story, Dawn would immediately spring into action. She wanted the story taken down for its apparent plagiarism, and she wanted Sonia held accountable. She contacted the Boston Book Festival, which had selected the story to be featured in their One City, One Story campaign that year. She contacted American Short Fiction magazine, which had published the story. But she went far beyond reaching out to organizations that platformed the particular text. She contacted the Grub Street Writing Center, where Sonia was once employed, to tell them that she had plagiarized her. She did the same to the Breadloaf Writing Conference in Vermont, where Sonia once had a scholarship, and the Vermont Studio Center. And ditto for the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers, of which Sonia was a member. And finally, she contacted the Boston Globe, offering to share her story. No, and she lawyers up, obviously. So immediately, this seems like overkill. To not only try to get the story taken down for what you see as copyright infringement, but also share what Sonia has done with any institution who has ever worked with her or shared her work, makes the issue seem personal. It's clearly not just about professional ethics, but instead about emotional harm done to Dawn and the desire to make Sonia feel consequences for it. Dawn doesn't try to hide the fact that it's personal. In fact, she emphasizes this point. Even before she read the story and learned about the letter being used, Dawn took major offense to Sonia's writing a story inspired by her donation without telling her. One message she sent to Sonia during their summer of 2016 email exchange was,
Here was a friend entrusting something to you, making herself vulnerable to you. At least the conclusion I can draw from your responses is that I was mistaken to consider us the friends that I did.
To her, adding Sonia to the Facebook group she made about her kidney donation was entrusting her and making herself vulnerable. Around the same time, she posted on Facebook,
I discovered that a writer friend has based a short story on something momentous I did in my own life, without telling me or ever intending to tell me.
She also sent a message to an advice podcast asking,
How does a writer like me, not suited to jadedness, learn to trust again after artistic betrayal?
She called just writing a story about the kidney donation without telling her artistic betrayal. So when she had reason to believe that she was also plagiarized as part of her story, it was like pushing her over an edge. You could read Dawn's actions as standing up for herself. As I mentioned, Sonia did something extremely risky from a legal standpoint and almost certainly unethical, taking credit for someone else's words without even citing them. Now at this point, Dawn didn't even know about the audible version of the story, the most blatantly infringing version, but the second version was still dubious at best. It clearly echoed the spirit and themes of Dawn's letter, and a few lines and phrases were only lightly changed versions of Dawn's original words. If Sonia was going to be so audacious as to assume she could get away with this, to assume that Dawn was such a nobody that her objections would fall on deaf ears if she ever did find out what she did, then doesn't she deserve to have her stupid plan blow up her whole career? I'm not really going to argue that Sonia doesn't deserve to experience the consequences of her actions. I'm actually going to save the entire conversation of who was in the wrong and to what degree for later in the video, because there's actually several more important developments to discuss before we get there. But I will say that Dawn's whole course of action reflects poorly on her. The mature and appropriate thing would have been to reach out to a lawyer who could send a cease and desist to the festival that was going to feature the story and any platforms that published it, which is exactly what her lawyer later did. But the additional actions come across as petty to me, and that's antithetical to the person Dawn presented herself as. Earlier, when I was discussing Dawn's character, I said that being egotistical or self-righteous about your own actions doesn't mean you can't still be compassionate. The situation Dawn was placed in when she discovered Sonia's wrongdoing felt like a real test of principles for her, and I think Dawn's response does slightly conflict with the person she presented herself as, a person whose entire brand is compassion, understanding, and grace would probably just let this go. For the sake of your career and maintaining positive relationships and professional connections, maybe erring on the side of forgiveness would just be the best move for everyone. But sure, Dawn decided she wanted Sonia to face the consequences for using her copyrighted material in her short story without her knowledge, permission, or credit, and that's fine. That is not wrong of her, that's what most people would do even if a more forgiving person would just let it go. You are allowed to be selfish if you have been legitimately wronged and want justice to be served. But then we have to ask, does she want Sonia to face the appropriate consequences, or does she want to ruin her career? Because ruining someone's career for what is honestly a pretty minor ethical transgression, a few lines in a short story taken from a letter you wrote, is beyond asserting yourself and your own worth. It's honestly vindictive. It's not building bridges, it's burning them. And there's no way to read her reaching out to every single place where Sonia ever worked or was associated with plagiarism allegations as anything other than trying to disrupt, if not destroy, her future career. Going to the press? That's pretty extreme. That's scorched earth stuff, not to mention an overestimation of how much this would matter to literally anyone outside of this extremely niche writing community. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that Dawn took such offense to this. Dawn clearly saw her donation as more than just a thing she did, but an extension of her person, a manifestation of her moral character, her goodness. To criticize the action would be indistinguishable from calling her a bad person. Yes, this was also her own life. The crystallization of the most important aspects of her personality, from the traumas of her childhood to the transcending of those traumas today. Her proudest moment, she told me, hadn't been the surgery itself, but making it past the psychological and other clearances required to qualify as a donor.
I didn't do it in order to heal. I did it because I had healed, I thought.
So for better or for worse, Dawn was not going to back down. As I mentioned, her lawyer sent a cease and desist to the Boston Books Festival in January of 2018, ordering them to hold off publishing and distributing the story under the Copyright Act. He would later suggest settling with Sonia and the festival for $5,000 plus an attribution at the bottom of the story, or perhaps a referral link to a kidney donor site. Unfortunately, due to her contract, Sonia retained liability for any legal claim brought against the story, so any legal fees or settlements against the festival would be her responsibility to pay. She retained her own lawyer, who claimed that Dawn's claim was not only unsound, but qualified as harassment, defamation per se, and tortious interference with business and contractual relations. In order to meet the definition of defamation against a non-public figure, you have to be deliberately spreading a falsehood about someone, resulting in harm against them. Dawn was reaching out to multiple different actors unrelated to platforming or publishing the story, including the press. It's easy to argue that she was trying to harm Sonia's career, and in many ways did. and Sonia's lawyer argued that these claims were also false. They argued that the lines from the letter supposedly lifted from Dawn's were not derivative at all. Instead, the similarities arose because they both echo the same tropes of a particular genre, the genre being letters that organ donors write and send to organ recipients. If the courts agree that this is a legitimate genre, then tropes would be considered ineligible for copyright protection. Basically, anyone would be able to use those tropes and no one writer would own them. Even having a few brief verbatim lines in common between sources wouldn't be a slam dunk, because with only a few ways to reword the same highly specific ideas, similarities are inevitable. But then Dawn found the audible version of the story, the one with the striking similarities between letters. With some quick timeline math, she figured out that Sonia had edited the story right after Dawn first found out about it and contacted her. Now, the Boston Festival had raised concerns with Sonia when Dawn first contacted them, even before she secured a lawyer and sent an official C&D. This was when Sonia changed the letter to the third version, which temporarily satisfied the festival. It didn't matter, though. Dawn's camp saw the audible version of the story as evidence against Sonia's defense, and with newfound vigor, increased their demands to $10,000. They also made it clear to the festival that they were prepared to sue no matter the version run. They considered any version of the kindest to be an infringing work, even if it didn't include any lines similar to Dawn's original letter. At this point, I basically disagree with the arguments of both sides. Firstly, Sonia's defense was probably reasonably confident that Dawn had no real claim, but their argument that no infringement occurred because this kind of correspondence between donors and recipients is its own genre is silly to me. Not only were some lines so similar that they could have only been derivative, but letters written by organ donors to recipients? If that's a genre, it's a genre entirely invented by Dawn Dorland, so maybe she does get ownership of its tropes. Sonia would even double down on the position that she never plagiarized, not even in the early versions of the stories. In the New York Times article, she's quoted as saying,
"I never copied the letter,"
and instead that she was just interested in certain phrases used by Dawn, and that she
played with this language in early drafts.
She would also plainly state,
"I have not done anything wrong."
I can acknowledge that she doesn't want to admit wrongdoing to a reporter in the middle of what was then an ongoing legal battle, but I can also say that she is in the wrong here. She did copy the letter, as we can obviously see. It's like the one mistake she's made here, and if she had just admitted it and settled earlier, back when all Dawn wanted was a line of attribution and $5,000, she could have avoided the situation that would eventually unfold. On the other side, Dawn is making a very different argument now. To say that any version of the kindest is copyright infringement feels bad faith. Dawn had never argued that the plot of the short story itself plagiarizes her. Her claims have been entirely focused on the letter itself. If the letter is completely changed or even absent, then what basis do your claims have? As Sonia said in the New York Times article,
"It's hard for me to see what the common denominator of all her demands has been, aside from wanting to punish me in some way."
Essentially, she doesn't want the story to be released, so she's using the issue of copyright and threat of lawsuits to block it. This is a famously effective strategy, and this instance was no exception. Even though the cost of any suit would fall entirely on Sonia, the very idea of legal trouble seemed to scare Boston Books, and they dropped Sonia and the kindest from the festival entirely, stating,
"That story should never have been submitted to us in the first place."
The director of the festival even wrote Sonia saying,
"You owe us an apology. It seems to me that we have grounds to sue you."
Dawn made her intention to suppress the story even clearer later on when she raised her demands to $15,000 along with an explicit agreement to never publish any version of the story again or face a $180,000 penalty. As you might guess, Sonia was pretty pissed at this point. Her story, which was once celebrated in the writing community and praised for its complex themes of ethnic identity, racial relationships, and personal redemption, was now inextricably linked to the cardinal sin of literature. Not to mention that the story being dropped from the Boston Festival only lent credence to Dawn's claims. She was hurt, embarrassed, and furious. And there was yet another layer we haven't addressed, the racial component. This isn't just a white author claiming credit to some degree for an author of color's work, but it's over a story about a white woman who demands special treatment and consideration from a woman of color that she tokenizes and mistreats. And just like how Rose in the story is blissfully unaware of the racial undertones of her interactions with Shantao, Dawn is either ignorant of or unwilling to acknowledge the connotations of her accusations against Sonia. After the Boston Globe published a small piece on the feud, Sonia wrote to the paper saying,
"It is not her story, and my letter is not her letter, and she shouldn't want it to be. She shouldn't want to be associated with my story's portrayal and critique of white savior dynamics. But her recent behavior, ironically, is exhibiting the very blindness I'm writing about, as she demands explicit identification in and credit for a writer of color's work.
Sonya's friends, the Chunky Monkeys, agreed that this was an example of racism and white privilege in the writing community at worst, and at the very least, a bad look. Many wrote to the Boston Books Festival in her defense, to no avail. The now very successful author Celeste Ng was quoted in the New York Times piece as saying,
"There's very little emphasis on what this must be like for Sonya and what it is like for a writer of color. Generally, to write a story and then be told by a white writer, actually, you owe that to me."
And there is evidence to her point. Most lay people commenting online these days focus on the emotional harm done by Sonya when she copied Dawn's words, or even the harm done by just accusing her of racist behavior. Very little thought is devoted to how hurtful it must have been for Sonya's entire career to be disrupted by Dawn's claims before their veracity was established in a court of law. Now, I don't blame Dawn for not wading into the weeds of this issue. If you do have a legitimate copyright claim against someone, it would really only hurt you to come out with a statement saying, "To be clear, this has nothing to do with race." But I do find her complete dissociation from the content of the story to be interesting. Because, you can't read The Kindest and think that Rose is a good person. Dawn had to know that being connected to this character would not make her look good. And yet, she was not at all shy about identifying herself as the source of inspiration. She initially demanded some kind of attribution at the bottom of the story. At no point anywhere in the New York Times article, at least, does she acknowledge the themes in The Kindest at all. In fact, there's even a point where she praises her own letter.
The whole reason they want it in the first place is because it's special. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother.
Although Dawn was considering taking Sonya to small claims court when their negotiations stalled, she soon found out that Sonya was suing her in federal court for defamation and tortious interference. This was in January of 2019. This would be followed in April 2020 by a countersuit on Dawn's part for copyright infringement and intentional infliction of emotional distress that required therapy. Being a lawsuit, it crept along slowly over the course of years, but they were also in the discovery process, in which both sides receive and review all relevant documents and evidence from the other side. And in early 2021, this would reveal every single text and email between Sonya and her friends about Dawn, her organ donation, the short story, and the ensuing drama. And guys, this stuff was mean, even for me. In response to a Facebook post about a parade where Dawn was walking to represent the live organ donation cause, one friend texted Sonya,
I don't know. A hashtag seems to me like a cry for attention.
Right? Hashtag do more for each other? Like, what am I supposed to do? Donate my organs?
At one point, Sonya wrote of the lawsuit,
She wants something from me. Something that she can show to lots of people, and I'm not giving it.
and a friend responded,
Maybe she's too busy waving from her floating thing at the Macy's Day Parade instead of, writing and stuff.
Perhaps most brutally of all, Sonya wrote to a friend,
Dude, I could write pages and pages more about Dawn, or at least this particular narcissistic dynamic, especially as it relates to race. The woman is a goldmine.
and she wrote this in the summer of 2016, right when she was trying to reassure Dawn that The Kindest was not about her. This was supposedly crushing for Dawn, as she took it as evidence that her community back in Boston, people she considered friends, were actually bullying, mocking, and ostracizing her. Perhaps worst of all, they were seriously questioning her motivations. It's like they thought she actually donated a kidney for clout and attention. But above all, it solidified her belief that Sonya had it out for her in particular. We can all agree that Sonya would not have written the story without knowing Dawn, and the main character was heavily based on her, but that still does not mean that she did it to deliberately hurt her. Dawn was confident that it was deliberate, though. This wasn't just a story that Sonya wrote with her as inspiration, it was all about exposing and ruining Dawn. Dawn even accused Sonya of using lines from her letter so that Dawn would read them, recognize it, and feel hurt, all while keeping the source of the letter a secret to those who don't know Dawn. Sonya would argue the opposite, claiming that she never set out to craft a takedown of Dawn. To her, Dawn was just a representation or an example of white savior dynamics in general, the launching pad for a story about so much more than just a kidney donation and a letter. She never set out to hurt Dawn by writing the story, but she also didn't particularly care if her feelings were hurt. What she said specifically in the New York Times was,
I don't care about Dawn.
and that's how things were left in October of 2021 when the New York Times published their article on the situation. According to Sonya's LinkedIn, she left Grub Street that same month, although I'm not sure of the circumstances. Dawn, meanwhile, was continuing to teach as well as travel the country to attend panels and conferences where Sonya was presenting. The reason she gave for this varied between a desire to confront her, to doing reconnaissance for her lawsuit, to a desire to heal trauma. The article, entitled Who's the Bad Art Friend, would bring a huge amount of outside attention to the situation. including a ton of hate to both Dawn and Sonia. The two sides would move for a summary judgment from the court. But before we get to the conclusion of the legal case, let's pause and do our best to answer who's morally in the wrong, at least who's more morally in the wrong. The title of the New York Times piece refers to how Dawn and Sonia could each be seen as bad art friends, misunderstanding the ethics and etiquette of writing. Sonia immediately saw Dawn as in the wrong because she had the audacity to assert ownership over details from her personal life, and believed that being inspired by people in real life is a normal convention of literature that Dawn just didn't get. It's like I mentioned earlier, she felt annoyed and uncomfortable that Dawn even reached out to her with objections in the first place, because normally writers don't have to explain and justify their sources of inspiration directly to those sources. But Sonia could also be seen as a bad art friend by those who thought she went too far, especially when it revealed she lifted lines directly from Dawn's letter. Plagiarism is an obvious faux pas of writing, one that doesn't need explanation. Not to mention, a huge aspect in my mind of this whole situation is how we're expected to treat friends versus non-friends. Dawn clearly saw them as friends, or at least former friends, and thus thought that her own discomfort and pain would be enough to make Sonia regret her actions. But Sonia, who did not ever see Dawn as a friend, thought that she owed her no more consideration than she would a random passerby on the street. Essentially, I understand that you're hurt, but it's not my responsibility to change my story to make you feel better. At the same time, much of the discussion around this article wasn't centered around specific actions. It was more vibes-based. Which woman seemed like a worse person? Who do you feel bad for the most, and who do you hate more? You know what the story reminds me of? It's an Am I the Asshole post. Am I the Asshole is a subreddit where people post real stories from their lives about interpersonal conflicts and ask Reddit if they were in the wrong. The thing about how the Reddit community responds to a lot of these is that people tend to get hung up on a few details. They get so obsessed with the different etiquettes of various social situations that they tend to miss the bigger picture. The funniest thing about this story is the more and more details you get, the more firmly you become entrenched in your own perspective. You could either keep hating on Dawn more and more the more you learn about her, or vice versa, because the details of the situation don't make either woman seem like a good person. Another reason the story was so divisive and went so viral is almost anyone can relate to it, even if they know absolutely nothing about the writing industry. In the grand scheme of things, the story is relatively common. One person thought they had friends when in reality nobody liked them very much, others gossiped behind their back, then their true feelings are revealed and drama ensues. One person presents themselves a certain way, but as you get to know them more and more, the more they seem like a self-centered narcissistic liar. I also think whether you relate more to Dawn or Sonia determines who you see as justified. There are two main perspectives offered in the New York Times article on how to view what happened between Sonia and Dawn. Let's take Dawn's perspective first. Dawn was a genuine person, just a sweet, kind-hearted woman who wore her heart on her sleeve and tried to form connections with everyone she met. She had reasons to believe that Sonia and the others at Grub Street were her friends, as they were amicable around her and made her feel like she was welcome in their community. But in reality, they were mocking her behind her back. We don't have any of their messages from when Dawn was still in Boston, because remember, she didn't even donate her kidney until she moved to the West Coast, but she may have assumed that these kinds of cynical, derisive comments started while she was still attending the Grub Street Writing Center. Additionally, Dawn claimed that members of the Chunky Monkeys were cold and distant to her on the occasion that she ran into them at conferences or events in the ensuing years since moving. Especially considering that Dawn was less successful and didn't have as much support outside of the community, this behavior could be seen as bullying, or punching down, or cliquish. This was a person that they were once friendly with and occasionally saw. Do they not owe her the benefit of the doubt, a single ounce of sympathy when the original donation saga was ongoing? Setting aside the ethics or legality, was writing a scathing takedown of a character by the very same name using literally her own words against her, and then publishing a little changed version of it not bad form on Sonia's part? Years after Dawn moved away, she's still so stuck on the woman that she's going to publish a cruel takedown piece, even directly mocking her own words. She didn't think that maybe, even if the idea had gripped her mind, it would be the mature thing to just let the topic go, as opposed to blasting her publicly. After all, what was Dawn's biggest sin? Being a little self-congratulatory about an action that most people would never even consider taking? Does saving someone's life not afford her a little bit of self-righteousness? All in all, this doesn't paint a good picture of Sonia, and obviously would make you less likely to let her off the hook for writing the kindest. Writing the story feels less like a professional or artistic decision and more like an extension of a personal vendetta. There's another way to see this, though. Let's say you're Sonia. You're in Boston working at Grub Street with your fellow aspiring authors, and then Dawn walks into your life. She seems nice, if a bit effusive or out of touch. Over time, though, you start to doubt the sincerity of her behavior, the way she constantly emphasizes service and healing and building bridges, but seems to always center herself in these conversations, not the people she's supposedly helping. But she hasn't done anything to hurt you, so you're friendly with her in response. Maybe she's not super talented. Maybe she has a slightly skewed vision of the importance of her own writing, but she seems really determined to make it work, to break into the writing world, and finally become a professional. She applies to work at Grub Street and is rejected. After a few years of seeing each other around, she moves away. You stay Facebook friends. After years pass, she is barely even a presence in your life, just somebody you used to kind of know. Then you see something odd on Facebook. She's made a Facebook group announcing that she's donating one of her own kidneys, and she's added you and a lot of other Grub Street acquaintances. Apparently, she really wants you all to know what she did. How did Dawn expect you to react, do you think? It felt like yet another example of Dawn doing something supposedly selfless, but for all the wrong reasons. You're done entertaining this woman, so you decide to not give her what she wants. You don't engage with any of the posts, you act like nothing happened. Publicly. Privately, you vent your frustrations to your friends. With her distant presence in your life, you feel a little more comfortable discussing this woman behind her back, but only to people who also knew Dawn. You wouldn't want to share these thoughts with anyone else for fear of being seen as a frigid bitch cynically criticizing the woman who just saved a stranger's life. But these people, they'd get it, because they remember what Dawn was like. Being so struck by Dawn's actions, you feel inspired to do what writers do, make it into a story. Your friends encourage you. After all, it is an undeniably juicy topic. You don't bother to run it by Dawn. She'd obviously reject publishing a story that eviscerates her like this, not to mention that legally she has no grounds to veto what you write. But then you think about that letter she posted, the one she sent to a real-life kidney donor. You think about how perfectly it captures the cluelessness of the kidney donor character, how well it would inspire the same revulsion in readers that it inspired in you when you read it for the first time. You know you shouldn't, but you can't stop yourself. It's just too good. If you see things this way, or anything close to it, you wouldn't blame Sonia for expressing her intense dislike of Dawn, and you'd probably also side more with Sonia when it comes to the issue of the kindest. Some outsiders saw Dawn in such a negative light that they didn't blame Sonia or the others for their contempt of her. After all, aren't some people worthy of ridicule? And sure, Sonia did base a character around Dawn and take some words directly from her letter, but Dawn should have just let it go. Her insistence on shutting down the story is just another example of her self-centered behavior. So those are obviously two diametrically opposed perspectives on the situation. I am almost sure that the real truth falls somewhere in between, as do most people's opinions on the situation. But my point is that you either agree more with Dawn's version of events or with Sonia's, even if almost everybody would agree that both women were at least somewhat in the wrong. But one big problem with this whole discourse, and in fact the New York Times article itself, is the major assumption at its base, the idea that Dawn and Sonia were friends. This colors the entire debate, making it a question of whether it's right to treat a friend this way. As I mentioned before, Sonia and Dawn disagree on this issue, and this affected what consideration they thought they owed to one another. This never made any sense to me, because as someone who's gone over the series of events multiple times, it is abundantly clear that, no, they were never friends, and it's not even reasonable to think that they were. Look at the time that Sonia was working on The Kindest, and Dawn was wondering why she didn't interact with any of her Facebook posts. Dawn reached out to her over email in July of 2015, at which point it had already been a while since they last spoke. They would not see each other again until March of 2016, and even then it was just a brief hello. If you can so easily go entire years without seeing someone and only reaching out once via email, are you even friends? Not to mention the fact that Dawn probably wouldn't have reached out if it weren't for the fact that Sonia hadn't acknowledged her kidney donation yet. I totally understand the concept of old friends that you only passively keep up with through social media. You don't want to admit that you've drifted apart, and it's nice to at least keep up tabs with them, but you should expect them to treat you as an acquaintance at most at that point. And then there's the question of whether they were even friends when they did see each other regularly. First of all, they mostly saw each other in professional situations, not by choice, and when they did hang out socially, it was always in groups. For what it's worth, Sonia explicitly says,
I'm very fortunate to have friends in my life who I've known for 10, 20, over 30 years. I do not and have never considered Dawn one of them.
And I believe her. Without doubt, what Sonia did caused Dawn pain. It was probably humiliating to see a caricature of yourself be the villain in a lauded short story, and hurtful to find out someone you thought was your friend was actually ridiculing you behind your back. The question of whether this behavior is acceptable for one friend to do to another is obvious to me. No, you shouldn't treat your friends this way, whether you're a writer or not. You don't exploit their words and life experiences and publish a story that makes them look awful without even giving them a heads up, let alone getting their permission. And if a friend does this to you, you'd certainly stop being their friend. So if we agree that this is not appropriate behavior for a friend, what about for whatever Sonia and Dawn were? Sonia clearly treated Dawn the way she thought she deserved. She gave her exactly as much consideration as she believed was warranted. Whether she deserved it is its own question, one that we can really only determine for ourselves in our own minds. Overall, although I try my best not to let Sonia off the hook for her very real mistakes, I can't deny that I sympathize more with her than Dawn. With the massive caveat that I do not know these people in real life, I still think it's safe to say that Dawn had a very divisive personality and often came across as very fake. There were even more examples of truly unreasonable, even unhinged behavior and words on her part in the New York Times piece that I didn't include in this video. I cannot stress this enough. Dawn sees herself as not just a victim, but a victim of serious trauma who did not a single thing wrong in this whole process. I understand how Sonia saw Dawn as self-important and conceited, egotistical and narcissistic, ignorant and tone-deaf. Of course, she was bound to vent her true feelings about her to others, and when she found out that others saw her in the same way, she probably felt justified in her judgments. As for keeping things friendly in real life back in Boston, I can't blame Sonia for that. Of course you want to keep things cordial with someone you're sharing a professional space with. That's not two-faced behavior, it's a very normal way to deal with someone you don't like but can't avoid. Having said that, I do feel that Sonia treated her a little harshly. Some of the worst things that Dawn did occurred after Sonia wrote The Kindest, like continuing with the lawsuit and endeavoring to end Sonia's career. Unless Dawn was way worse in person, I don't see how the act of posting publicly about her kidney donation, even the tone-deaf and potentially inappropriate move of posting the letter, was enough to justify such a brutal and personal takedown. I'm sure that there were a lot of other things she did back in Boston that made Sonia and the other chunky monkeys hate her, but dislike does not give you carte blanche to be as immature, petty, and mean-spirited as you want. When it comes to what Dawn did wrong, I think her insistence that all versions of The Kindest are infringing is ridiculous, and her attempts to prevent it from being published amount to abuse of the legal system. Additionally, her tattling on Sonia to anyone and everyone who ever worked with her was just as immature, petty, and mean-spirited as Sonia's comments, with even more serious real-world effects. You want to know another reason I see Sonia as being petty for writing this piece about Dawn? It's that The Kindest isn't even a good short story. In the same way I can say Dawn didn't donate her kidney for entirely selfless reasons, I can also say that Sonia didn't write The Kindest for entirely artistic reasons. She didn't write this because she just had such a great story in her mind, one that begged to be published. She wrote it because she really couldn't get over just how badly she hated Dawn. And a pretty good piece of evidence for this is just that the story is not good enough to justify this entire legal battle. The version of The Kindest that I read was the one featuring the third letter, one of the latest versions that exists. To review the plot once more, a Chinese-American woman named Shun Tao gets into an accident that requires her to get a kidney transplant. Shun Tao immediately strikes you as deeply cynical and bitter, an alcoholic with no apparent appreciation for her family or the anonymous donor who saved her life. She seems honestly disappointed in the fact that she survived her ordeal. When she was dying, she was treated with respect, care, and attention. While she was safely recovering, though, she went back to being treated as an addict, distrusted and handled rather than worried about and fussed over. Except now with the added expectation that she'd be even more conscientious and taking care of herself. Now, anything she did had the potential to not just harm herself, but to squander this sacrifice made by another person, to physically hurt this manifestation of her second chance at life. Then comes the letter. The donor, with the notably alliterative name of Rose Rothario, writes to introduce herself and asking if they should meet. Shun Tao is not jazzed about the idea, but her husband Bao insists that they must, as he is deeply grateful for her donation and feels obligated to express this. When the donor arrives, the meeting does not go well. Rose immediately gives odd signs. She looks around their house like she's analyzing it. It's described as if she's an onlooker at a zoo. Bao makes them some snacks and she takes a photo of them because she's just so taken. She's enamored by a Zeton chair in the living room, asking if it's a family heirloom and calling it a stunning relic. Things get even worse when Bao leaves the two of them alone. Rose keeps making attempts to open up, to connect on a deeper level, a fruitless endeavor considering Shun Tao never wanted to have this meeting in the first place and really can't wait for it to be over. Eventually, when Shun Tao bluntly asks Is there something you want? Rose completely breaks down sobbing. Despite the fact that Shuntao is intensely uncomfortable and even angry, she makes an effort to comfort Rose. I hear you, she says. When I was dying, people were nicer. And to this, Rose replies, What are you saying? It becomes clear that when Rose was prompting Shuntao to open up emotionally, she was only doing it because she expected gratitude, hope, catharsis. But when Shuntao shares her own cynical, miserable musings on her experience with dying, ones that importantly have nothing to do with Rose, she shuts it down, and she quickly directs it back to herself, asking Shuntao, Have you told people about me? And what did they say? When Rose pulls herself together, she manages to say that she wants to take a photo with Shuntao, who doesn't like the idea, but figures it might satisfy her enough to leave. Rose chooses where they will take it, and she selects the Zeton chair. Finally, at the end of the meeting, Rose has something to take away, a photo of herself and the woman whose lives she saved. Rose couldn't conceive of giving away a piece of herself entirely selflessly in a way that 100% centers the recipient. Rose clearly expects a gushing thanks from Shuntao. She expects to be treated as a hero, a savior, and it's heavily implied that she wanted that. She certainly wanted something, given how crushed she was when she received absolutely nothing from Shuntao. Overall, this meeting ended up feeling strangely inhuman. She doesn't connect with her hosts on a human level, but instead keeps up a strange act. Oddly, by insisting on such an intense emotional relationship right off the bat, she is asking Shuntao to act inauthentic, to perform emotions for her benefit, when in reality, they are just two strangers sitting on a couch with nothing in common save for their blood and HLA types. It's meaningful that this meeting took place in Shuntao and Bao's living room, not Rose's home or out in a cafe. Rose is a stranger, an invader who strolled into their life and forced them to accommodate her. Part of it seems attributable to her effusive personality, and part of it seems very racially coded. So certainly, Sonia was right when she insisted that the story is about a lot more than just a kidney donation. A huge chunk of the story is based on Shuntao's musings about the nature of the world rather than Rose herself. It's about a misanthrope who quite literally drove herself to the edge of her life, was pulled back nearly against her will, and is now expected to act grateful for the entire experience, as if almost dying is an inherently redeeming act, as if recovering from addiction and depression is made easier by having a near-death experience. After briefly tasting unconditional love and constant care, she is now more alone than ever. Ironically, that care and attention she received when she was dying, that worship, is instead transferred to her savior, the kidney donor. Miserable and helpless, Shuntao doesn't even try to get better. The second she gets stressed, she looks for cigarettes and booze, for mouthwash or vanilla extract. She ignores her family's calls and texts, and when Rose tries to draw recognition out of Shuntao like she's pulling teeth, she refuses to give Rose what she wants. As Sonia Larson said about the character,
She resisted, and I admired that.
both central characters are entirely self-centered, but only Shuntao knows it. So what makes me say that a text as rich as this is not good? The main reason is just that the prose is bad. Like, for example, the inner monologue of Shuntao. Can you say no way? Whoa now, hold up. I get the stylistic choice, it's meant to place you in her head, but it clashes quite a bit with the more poetic lines that she throws in there too. There's strange use of punctuation, like, okay, I could see that he didn't want me to. And oh my god, the white tile floors, so shiny. Not to mention the overuse of M dashes, like, I am the king of overusing M dashes, but I do that in scripts that are intended to be read aloud, not fictional stories intended to be read. There's one point where she calls the day the letter came a sunny, ignorant day, or another one where she calls a chair cushion bony that makes me raise my eyebrows more than anything. There are also some lines that were very good. I will include one of my favorite passages at the end of this section. But overall, the main word I would use to describe both the writing style and quality would be inconsistent. Additionally, the narration lacks a sense of neutrality. Yes, it is written in first person, but there are points where the main character's voice seems to drop away and instead a third person comes to weigh in on the situation like they're backing up Shuntao's assessments. And this supposedly neutral voice is as biased against Rose as Shuntao is. For example, when her letter arrives, along with a note from the transplant surgeon explaining what it is, the text stops to say, so awestruck was he by the selflessness that he just had to chaperone the missive himself. But would Shuntao even stop to wonder about the surgeon's motivations? If she did, would she be so indirect and sarcastic about it? Or would she be blunt and just say what she thinks of the action? I think this is Sonia stepping in to establish that all of these characters somewhat unreasonably view Rose with pure approval except for Shantao. And Sonia does this with a hint of the same derision that she uses to write about Rose. The Kindest's other major flaw is, in a way, one of the things that makes it the most interesting. Rose is not a character, she's a plot device, and I don't think Sonia intended that. You might have picked up by now that Rose is pretty cartoonish. This isn't a story with a lot of subtlety. Now, there are reasons why fiction, especially short texts, might eschew nuance deliberately, but The Kindest is not a satire. It's also not, I would argue, a story entirely about how Shantao reacts to the actions of a straw man. I think this is supposed to be about an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. One about a self-absorbed woman who demands something from another self-absorbed woman who refuses to indulge her. In short, a story about two real people. But Shantao is the only one of the two women who is afforded the right to be a human being. We barely learn anything about Rose's inner world, her life, her motivations, maybe for fear of making her too sympathetic. As Katie Waldman of The New Yorker said,
Rose has exactly 3 personality traits, which are entitlement, ignorance, and annoyingness.
Shantao is also a pretty awful person, I grant you that, but she is allowed to be sympathetic in a way that Rose is decidedly not. There is one devil's advocate counter-argument to this that I'll throw out. Sonia pointed out that some readers, especially white readers, still missed the point of the story. They still failed to see the inappropriateness of Rose's behavior and didn't pick up on the white savior narrative. This could explain why the Rose character is so over the top. Maybe Sonia set out to create a character so unlikable, so indefensible, that if you still consider Shantao the bad guy, your own biases are made obvious. You can never underestimate the audacity and ignorance of some white people, but to this I would argue, should you really write your stories with the intent to make them idiot-proof? In my opinion, it's okay if the most deeply biased and unthoughtful white readers miss the point of the story. The messaging would have gone over their heads anyway. Is it not better to make a story that's messy, that's debatable, that still conveys your themes but does so in a way that better echoes how they show up in the real world? Is that not what makes art so engaging? But if I am going to be honest, I don't even think this was on purpose. I don't think Sonia set out to make a straw man character to function as a plot device or expose the reader's implicit biases. I think she tried to create a three-dimensional character who herself could reflect many biases, including those of white people, of narcissists, of those who build their identities around being good people. But her contempt for Dawn led to a complete inability to sympathize with her, even a fictional version of her, and you cannot create complex characters without sympathizing with them to a certain degree. I'll finish this section with this excerpt from the very end of the story. The photo would be fuzzy, rough with sediments of darkness, but I knew that she would treasure it always. Because the thing about the dying is they command the deepest respect. Respect like an underground river resonant with primordial sounds, the kind of respect that people steal from one another. Dawn was suing Sonia for copyright infringement and emotional distress, and Sonia was suing Dawn for defamation and tortious interference. In February 2021, a federal judge threw out the emotional distress claim, and later that same year, the two sides moved for a summary judgment from the court on the remaining torts. By moving for a summary judgment, both sides are saying that there was no material issue of fact, basically agreeing on the factual events of what happened, just disagreeing on whether a tort was committed. This allows for a judge to return a judgment without a trial. And in September of 2023, the court returned that judgment. So between 2015 and 2018, Larson wrote 3 versions of The Kindest, each featuring a different version of the letter that Dawn posted to Facebook. Dawn's camp asserted that all 3 versions of the story violate the copyright of her letter. Sonia's camp asserted that none do. While she acknowledged that the earlier 2 versions were similar to Dawn's letter, she claimed that they were protected by fair use anyways. The court decided that the first version was substantially similar to Dawn's. The second was not so striking that no reasonable juror could conclude that the 2 letters are meaningfully different, which is to say that a reasonable juror could side with Sonia on that one, but it was still basically infringing. And the third was not substantially similar to Dorland's letter and therefore not infringing. However, the court also agreed with Sonia that the first 2 versions, while infringing, were protected from liability by fair use. Therefore, Sonia was found not liable.
As to plaintiff Sonia Larson's second amended complaint, judgment is hereby entered in favor of defendant Dawn Dorland Perry as to counts 1, intentional interference with Larson's advantageous business relationship with American Short Fiction, 2, intentional interference with Larson's advantageous business relationship with the Boston Book Festival, and 7, defamation, and in favor of Larson as to count 8, declaratory judgment pursuant to this court's memorandum and order.
So for people like me who early on assumed that copying parts of a letter verbatim into your story was blatantly illegal, turns out not. Yes, it was copyright infringement, but that doesn't mean the end of the case. Some forms of infringement are protected. Notably, the court did state that the first two versions of the letter copied so much from Don's original that they weighed the scales against a finding of fair use, but that due to multiple other factors, a finding of fair use was still justified. The main reason that the court determined that Sonia's use of the letter constitutes fair use was the purpose of the letter was completely different from what Dawn intended when she published hers. The short story utilized the letter to starkly contrast an altruistic kidney donor's view of her own actions with a view a recipient may have of the same actions. Not to build on Dorland's thoughts, emotions, and feelings about altruistic kidney donation, or to seek to provide factually accurate information about the process of living kidney donation. In fact, the court determined that the way the letter was used was obviously a criticism of an altruistic kidney donor's choice to reach out to a kidney recipient. Therefore, Dawn's letter and all versions of Sonia's letters were at opposite ends of the spectrum of writing about kidney donation, and the two artists had diverging motivations in creating their respective pieces. Essentially, the use was transformative because it qualified as criticism. Additionally, Sonia's short story in no way hurt the market for Dawn's letter, and in fact may have drawn more attention to the original. While copyright holders usually enjoy the right to control the first public distribution of their work, Dawn had already published and widely shared her letter and encouraged others to do so. Dawn's argument that Sonia's bad faith personal comments about me precluded her right to quote fair use was rejected. Instead, the court determined that copyright law is not concerned with a person's generally good or bad character, but rather whether that person obtained copyrighted material using egregious and inappropriate means. Now, what about Sonia's claims of defamation and intentional interference with her work?
As to counterclaim plaintiff Dorland's counterclaim, judgment is hereby entered in favor of counterclaim defendant Larson as to counts 1, copyright infringement, and 2, declaratory judgment. And Dorland's claim for injunctive relief, count 3, is dismissed as moot pursuant to this court's memorandum and order. Count 4, intentional infliction of emotional distress, is dismissed with prejudice for failure to state a claim pursuant to this court's memorandum and order.
Her claims ended up amounting to nothing as well. Defamation is pretty hard to prove in court, as many allegations of defamation or libel are aimed at opinions which are protected, and you're also allowed to use facts to back up your opinions, such as the indisputed fact that some phrases appear in both Dawn's letter and Sonia's short story. Additionally, Dawn didn't outright call Sonia a plagiarist in the communications with third parties. Instead, she submitted both texts and pointed out that some were blatantly copied. Truth of a statement is an absolute defense to defamation, and Sonia was kind of screwed when she admitted that she took lines verbatim from Dawn's letter, because it was basically an admittance that Dawn's claims were true. Some lines were outright copied from one to another. Sure, this does not hold true for the third version of the letter, but because it is for the other two, Dawn's statements were at least substantially true and thus protected. As for the claims of tortious interference with business relationships, Sonia failed to demonstrate any actual harm that occurred. She was paid the full sum of her contract with her publisher and couldn't point to any opportunities that were lost following the Boston Books Festival dropping her. So there was no harm for Dawn to be held liable for. And there we go. The US justice system did what it was made for and returned a decision. The whole saga ends in basically a draw, with both sides losing their arguments, and how ironic for the end result to be that neither Dawn nor Sonia ended up owing anything to the other one.
All parties shall bear their own costs and fees. This case is closed. It is so ordered.
So, why does all of this matter? I saw some other journalists call this story a nothing burger that didn't belong in the New York Times, saying that this is obscure, niche writing world drama irrelevant to most people. Well, I obviously disagree just based on its pure entertainment value, and believe me, the New York Times is not above sharing stories based on that alone, but I also think that this story does mean a lot for us as a society. Both the story itself, and especially the conversation around it, exposed many misconceptions and just bad opinions regarding free speech and the ethics of writing about people you know. For example, many comparisons were drawn between this case and the drama surrounding the Cat Person short story that was published by The New Yorker. I am not going to rehash that story here as well, maybe it'll be another video, I don't know. But the one-sentence summary is that an author wrote an extremely popular short story about a young woman dating an older man who wasn't everything he seemed up front. And a short while later, the woman who supposedly inspired the story wrote a piece in Slate describing how she felt uncomfortable and exploited by the author using elements of her real life without her permission. In general, writers were pretty united against the Slate article and defended the author, evoking the same argument that Sonia did in defense of The Kindest. People do not and cannot own the copyright to things that happened in their lives, and there's nothing you can do to prevent others from being inspired by you and incorporating those details into their stories. But wait, you might be asking, that doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical. And yeah, I agree. There were things that the Cat Person author, Kristen Ropenian, could have done to better protect the identity of the woman on which the main character is based. Like, there's no reason the story needed to take place in the exact same university that the real-life people attended. But overall, I feel like her actions were unethical either. People who took the side of the Slate writer tended to only focus on the unintentional harm done by the author, without considering the damage that could be done by shaming writers for doing something that writers have always done, and realistically speaking, cannot stop doing. It's true that the vast majority of stories are based on something real, usually involving other people. I think it's unethical for it to be easily traceable back to the real person, but not for it to just draw on their lives. I can only present my own 2 cents, and I don't mean to imply that anyone who disagrees is certainly wrong. I do feel more confident criticizing other people's opinions when they seem to completely miss key points of what they're discussing, though. And when people explain that Sonia was the asshole because she created a character overwhelmingly similar to a person from her past, I can't call them wrong, but I will say that Dawn is even more of an asshole in my opinion for abusing the legal system to shut down the publication of a story just because she doesn't like how Sonia handled the situation. Before I said the devil lies in the details, and by learning more and more details to the story, you can either align yourself more with Sonia or Dawn. In the same way though, the big picture can suit either one of them. Whenever articles in response to the New York Times piece have to quickly summarize what happens, I feel Sonia ends up the obvious bad guy. A woman donated a kidney out of the goodness of her own heart, and a former friend lurked on her social media copying her life story and even stealing directly from a letter she wrote. Seems clear-cut. But on the other hand, if you say a woman deliberately set out to ruin a writer's career over a few lines in one short story that were protected by fair use anyway, and her motivations seem to be entirely a desire to suppress the story from being published, not a desire to see copyright infringers face penalties in court, then Dawn ends up the villain. While on an interpersonal level, Sonia seems to be the obvious asshole, on a legal level, Dawn was, for the most part, in the wrong. And then we're back to the distinction between legality and morality. Well, here's my very unpopular opinion, though. I think it's actually more valuable to side with the person who's legally in the right than it is to side with the person who seemed nicer and more relatable. Sure, being a good friend should matter to you as an individual, but we don't know these people. They are not our friends. And as a society, what we should care about is setting a precedent for artistic freedom and free speech within the limits already imposed by copyright and libel laws. I know the legal system is not perfect, and there are cases you can point to where courts made questionable decisions both in favor of and against the artist. But in the big picture, I think erring on the side of free speech is the wise decision. In our own lives, as laypeople, we can do the same thing by extending the benefit of the doubt to the artist whenever conflicts like this arise. And if someone does create something based off of you that makes you uncomfortable but isn't legally actionable, then you can drop them as a friend like a sack of potatoes, and I certainly wouldn't say that you're wrong. I guess that's the thing that sucks about discussing this story. While I agree both women's actions were bad, I also think both were valid in their feelings. Dawn was right to feel hurt and uncomfortable for becoming the villain of a story, and Sonia was right to feel attacked for doing something that writers normally do. Without a doubt, y'all should go read this New York Times article. I tried to do my best to summarize the story, but there was so much more I couldn't include at all, let alone unpack the implications. Like, there was more backstory, there were subplots, there were supporting characters, it's a whole anime. Also, when I set out to make this video, I thought that nobody on YouTube had talked about it, but it seems there are actually a couple of others. So definitely go watch those as well to get some other perspectives, including from those within the writing community with way more relevant expertise than me. I decided to make this video anyway, just so that I could get my own thoughts out there as well. If you couldn't tell from the length of this video, I did my best to include every possible angle and argument you could approach this topic from, and even then I had to cut some thoughts. Additionally, I tried so hard not to be mean and to be as neutral as possible, but I had to stop and rant every now and then. And I am prepared to keep up the yapping in the comments, so if you disagree, come to the replies with both fists up and I will meet you there. I honestly hope that both Dawn and Sonia are doing great out there. I can't call them good people because I don't know them, and I don't think I want to, although I would kill to have one single conversation with either of them, but I do wish them the best. This bizarre chapter of their lives is now concluded, and I'm willing to bet both want to move past this. I just had to make this video now, years after the fact, because if I don't, the story will be burning a hole in my brain until the day that I die. On an unrelated topic, if I were to donate a kidney, would anyone want to join a Facebook group on the subject? My upstairs neighbor is rewatching just the ending scene of Wicked over and over again and has been for the last 2 hours.